Very much. Let me say that it's a pleasure to be presenting from California to Western Australia. It's a brave new world we live in, it would appear. Let me also say hello specifically to Rod Tyers, who his macro course when I was barely out of diapers, I remember fondly. So it's very nice to see you. This is joint work with Alan Collard Wexler, who's at Duke, and Jan de Luca, who's at Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. And this is the sort of second component of an ongoing agenda we've had, trying to unpack the impact of OPEC on the world since about 1970, which is also a vehicle for us to think about market power in various ways. In a fairly structured way. So in terms of introducing the exercise here, what I'd like to do is to step back a little bit and talk about recent research, which is to say sort of typical research in IO in the last 30 years. If you read the typical, say, job market paper that an empirical IO person has written in the last 20 years, perhaps longer, it will fall into more or less two categories. One is to spend a hell of a lot of time estimating a demand curve, usually for a differentiated products market in a very tortuous way, and then taking the demand elasticities that come out of that, sticking it into a first order condition that's derived from a model which is intended to describe competition in some way, and then pop out marginal cost. And so you end up with a demand curve, a marginal cost curve, and the link between the two is a function of a fairly detailed industry model that describes observed behavior. And this is what I refer to as the conduct demand approach. Now, typically what you're doing there is you're going to assume that firms basically have the same marginal cost curves, perhaps up to a shifter or something. But mostly what that does is, if you think about economic welfare, is that it means you're well equipped to think about deadweight loss, the standard monopoly triangle type issues, but you're really not well equipped to think about the welfare impact of reallocating production across productive units. And that's essentially a function of the fact that you've got no insight into the efficiency of inframarginal units of production. Conversely, there's another line of sort of typical IO research, which will use what we might think of as cost data, and often will estimate, say, a production function. So that'll be a projection of revenue on a labor measure, a capital measure, maybe some materials and other stuff. And then what they'll look at is the allocation of production across different productive units, being confident that you've done a good job of estimating their productivity differences. But so you can talk about the productive benefits to reallocation of resources, but because you have no sense of a demand curve, you don't get the sort of deadweight loss triangles or anything like that. So, a good example of approach one would be something like Aviv Nevo's work on ready-to-eat cereal in 2000. Good example of approach two would be like Ollie Pecos in the mid-90s. What we're trying to do here is to think about how can you have an empirical approach which does sort of two things. One is to allow you to get both a productive inefficiency and deadweight losses, so benefits from reallocation and also welfare costs from foregone production. And the second is to get away from this typical hang-up that IO modeling has, which is we have to model things which are quite complicated. Now, the application here is going to be on OPEC, which is obviously a significant cartel in the world, and one that exercises significant market power. And it's also one which is an absolute horror to try and model, because over the course of the last 50 years, among other things, they've changed the way they work many times. Members of the cartel have literally been at war with each other, any number of other things which are difficult to summarize in a first order condition, for instance. So, that's a very high level of sort of where this might fit into, the broad sweep of the kind of IO exercises you might see in the RAND journal or something like that. Let me now talk more specifically about what we're going to do. We're going to introduce an empirical framework that allows a complete welfare analysis of a cartel. And I'm going to spend a fair bit of time today talking about exactly what I mean by that. We're going to apply this to OPEC. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is it's just really big and important. And, part of the exercise here is to do some empirical IO on an industry which is globally important. So important, in fact, that even my macro colleagues might pay attention to it. I once heard a prominent IO economist say that in IO, we measure things in units of yogurt. And in this exercise, we're going to be measuring things in trillions of dollars. This may seem a little trite, but if you think about the history of economics and the interface between macro and IO, for me at least, the early work of Harberger is particularly important. He has a very interesting paper in the mid-50s where he comments that, after having looked at the social cost of monopoly in the US in the 1920s, he says that basically you're fine if you assume that everything is perfectly competitive. And part of the exercise here is to present some evidence on a specific, cartel and episode of monopolization, which generates sufficiently large effects that you might appreciate that it could have a macro impact. So, the punchlines are sort of going to be, we're going to contribute to a small but important literature in IO, empirically measuring the impact of a cartel on a market. This is smaller than you might think because it's usually quite difficult to spot cartels and work out what they're doing because they're illegal. In this particular instance, because of doctrines around sovereign immunity, OPEC can do whatever it likes and is pretty open about it. There's some work to do with measuring that impact. That means we have to go back to the old Lipsey and Lancaster theory of the second best in thinking about the appropriate way to measure impact here. And that's a function of the fact that there's many distortions in this industry separate from monopoly power. There's a link to the old macro market power debate. That's the Harberger stuff I just talked about. And then there's some methodology stuff, which is the kind of the empirical line of attack, excuse me, is going to be a little bit different from the typical approach in IO. And so, which is largely around the fact that we're going to take the world as given and compare the world to various constructed versions of what a social planner might do, as opposed to trying to measure, model, observe conduct, and then use first order conditions or something to pop out latent variables. Okay. So let's just get specific. So what I'm going to do today is to first talk about the welfare objects at issue here. Although oil is obviously a finite resource, so there's some dynamics involved in modeling this appropriately, I'm going to talk about this in static terms because that's where the economic content is. Following that, I'll introduce you to the industry, talk about the data sets we have and give you some descriptives. Then I'll talk about the framework we're going to leverage in a little more detail, and then go through the blocking and tackling of popping out demand estimates and costs and so on. And then stitch it all together to give you some results. So let's do some basic welfare economics. And let me say this is stuff I like doing because it takes me back to the things I learned as an undergraduate. It's a continual frustration to me that we don't teach this stuff properly in PhD programs in the US anymore. So I'm enormously grateful to the ANU for bashing this stuff into me in a fairly unforgiving way. What I want you to consider is a market in which there's a dominant group of firms, which is in this instance a cartel. But think about these guys as the folks that have monopoly power, and give me that they all have constant marginal costs, and there's some sort of capacity constraint. Also want you to consider that there's a fringe of firms out there who are not part of this group, who are price takers. And this fringe has a upward sloping supply curve, and they're generally higher cost than the cartel. This will just make exposition easy. They all sell the same product, right? So everything's homogeneous, no product differentiation. So if we stick that into a diagram, it looks like this, right? Here's our group of firms in the cartel. Here's their constraint. Here's the fringe. And market clearing, if everyone's a price taker, looks as indicated. Now, of course, when you have market power, you realize the profits from it by withholding supply. So what the group with market power is going to do is to pull back production, and we get a new equilibrium with a high price up here, new quantity, and obviously now we have some welfare triangles to evaluate. So the first of these triangles is this one, which is our traditional deadweight loss, which is to say this is the welfare loss from production that's foregone, right? The alternative, in addition to that, there's another welfare loss, which is this, which is the increased cost to the economy of production, which is still occurring, but it's being done by productive units which are higher cost than those that are actually available, right? So this is what I'm going to call productive inefficiency. Okay. And, in this environment, the total welfare loss is the combination of the two. So there's the foregone gains from trade, that's deadweight loss. And then there's the increase in the resource cost of some units of production by virtue of them being reallocated to less efficient productive units. Now, if this was the entire story, things would be relatively straightforward, right? I'll talk about this with the picture. Let's think about what we'd have to do to analyze this and engage in quantification. We'd need to estimate a demand curve, right? We know how to do that. If we had good cost data, what we would see in reality is this and this curve here, right? In other words, we would see the production costs of units actually engaged in production. What we would need an economic model for is working out what the social planner would actually do, which is to say we'd need to trace out this curve down here, this counterfactual production schedule, which would be what the social planner would choose to use. Okay.
Excuse me, John, may I ask a question?
Shoot.
I just wonder, for this particular example, you're focusing on OPEC, how the macro framework is adapting to policies like a climate change.
Oh, right, yeah. So we're going to completely ignore climate change in terms of welfare analysis here, right? Which is not to say we don't think it's important. We actually, we're looking at doing another exercise where we fold that in. Clearly that would you'd have to factor in a social cost of carbon into this. To the extent that we've done a back of the envelope on this, our best guess is that if you got rid of OPEC, you would have to probably double the kind of carbon taxes that you see floating around in the literature, right? OPEC increases prices. A typical carbon tax is in the order of $50 a barrel. And, more or less kind of at the moment, OPEC is probably costing the world around $50 a barrel, depending on which time period you pick. So, our suspicion is that if you get rid of OPEC, you have to substantially increase any carbon tax you'd want to impose. If you're taking this sort of Pigovian approach to internalizing the climate change externality, that you still may want to get rid of OPEC in the sense that while they're giving you a beneficial price effect, you might take issue with the fact that it's accruing in the pockets of Saudi princes and not being given to governments who could spend those resources in slightly more socially useful ways. But to the extent that I have anything to say about climate change and welfare, you've now heard everything sensible that I've thought about so far.
Thank you.
Can I ask a related one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so here you said that you're using a static analysis framework, but the demand in particular seems to me that it'll be more sensible to use a dynamic model because people respond to things like OPEC cartel. I mean, this happened in the US, for example. The kind of cars that people are demanding changed over time. So it seems to me that like the consumers respond in terms of, the demand becomes more elastic over time. And also there's the R&D impact of cartels, right? They might actually have the Schumpeterian argument that they might actually lead to more R&D.
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to all of that. Where we are going to put dynamics into the empirical approach is, just taking very seriously the classical idea that if you don't dig it out of the ground today, you've got it around tomorrow. So there's hoteling rents floating around on the production side, which are internalizing that sort of opportunity cost of extraction. In terms of understanding kind of where the welfare objects are that we're estimating, that this static representation is just helpful for being clear rather than swamping you with ugly notation. We're not going to put in the kind of demand dynamics that you're talking about. Mainly because we have enough trouble getting to where we're going to go already. That said, I recommend that everyone look carefully at the Berry, Levinson, Pecos article in Econometrica in the mid-90s and forget about all the econometric stuff and just look at the summary stats, and you'll see very clearly exactly what you're talking about. That following the oil shocks in the late 70s and through 1980 or so, with about a 2 to 3 year lag, the miles per gallon of US cars goes up considerably. And then it tapers off after about 1990, when they've had a bunch of years of low oil prices and people start, wanting to buy F-150 trucks that, go 2 miles a gallon. But it's, there's a bunch of wrinkles like this that I'll try and point out, but I don't want to disguise the fact that we're going to skid over a few things here to get a baseline quantification.
Okay.
If I might, one of the central problems we do have, which we need to grapple with, is that there's lots of taxes and lots of other distortions in this market. Something that's very useful to keep in mind is that there's a bunch of countries where the majority of the government revenue comes from oil royalties and other forms of taxation. So for instance, depending on the metric, 30–40% of Russia's government revenue comes from oil taxes and royalties. right? So, since getting sort of paying attention to this industry, I've noticed that Putin tends to go down to Saudi Arabia about once a year to make sure that he's on good speaking terms with the King of Saudi Arabia. And once you understand where Russia gets their money from, that's no accident. Similarly, Nigeria gets about 75% of their government revenues from oil-related instruments, and all of this stuff is distortionary. There's also nationalized industries all over the place, and so on. What that means for us is that we can't literally do this exercise. We need to take into account there's other distortions. And that raises the question about how you do the measurement. So we're going to do two things. One thing you could do would be to measure the impact of market power given all the other distortions out there. And we're going to call that the marginal approach. The other thing you might do is to say, in the absence of any other distortion, how much is market power messing things up? And that's different. We're going to call that the inframarginal approach. The reason we draw this distinction is because the original insights of Lipsey and Lancaster in the theory of the second best mean that when you have multiple distortions in the market, they don't just stack additively, right? They interact with each other, and they can offset each other. They can interact more than additively, so the sum can be say 3 times the components, any of that stuff. And we want to take that seriously and be structured in how we approach that issue. So what that means...
Sorry, I was wondering if I could ask a quick question before you get to your detailed tech. One of the distortions, I think, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, is that if you take Saudi Arabia, for example,
yes.
They produce oil, generating more income than they can consume, and so they have a very high saving rate. And how do they save? Well, a lot of the way they save, we know they buy all kinds of property around the world and so on, but a lot of the way they save is to hold US Treasury bonds.
Yes.
And so that means then that the opportunity cost of producing oil is what they can earn, or in a sense, what they give up in terms of yields on US Treasury bonds that they would buy with the product.
Yeah.
And that, it seems to me, then means that you've got very yield sensitive production, especially in a place like Saudi Arabia. It's probably not true in countries where they're at their maximum output most of the time for various political or economic reasons. But for someone like Saudi Arabia, then holding back may well be an option to maximize income if the yield on the treasuries you're going to buy with the product is incredibly low, which is what it has been. So it seems to me, and we're observing right now yields on long-term treasuries going from 0.6 to 2.6 or something %. Right? Yeah. So that makes a difference, I would have thought, just as an alternative driver of what's going on behind this.
Yeah, I mean, every country that has a sovereign wealth fund will have a similar set of incentives. So Norway, for instance, would be in the same boat.
Yeah.
All the Gulf states. Saudis, I would layer on further complications. So, for instance, in the political science literature, I've seen Saudi Arabia described in odd terms, which is, in some sense, what the ruling class are doing is trying to make sure that the Bedouins don't come in from the desert and just erase, the state. So whereas in countries like Australia, we might have a social contract, which is something like, I pay taxes and I expect services. In Saudi Arabia, it's, I don't destroy your city and you give me gold. You can imagine that creates an interesting commitment problem for the government, right? Because if they sucked it all out of the ground now, then that would just increase the payoff to the folks that want to raise your city. So I'm conscious of these difficult political economy things, in addition to the sort of the macro finance stuff that you point out. It's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to do incredible violence to this, I'm sorry to say, and assume that at least the social planner has a discount factor that applies equally to how they think about production in all countries. That because it's a finite extraction problem, that discount factor is really where a lot of this opportunity cost comes in terms of the model. So let me just say yep, and
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
In any case, this marginal approach, what you want to do is to think about when there's other distortions out there, what's market power doing? So the world is as you find it, which is to say this curve. But what you want to do is for the social planner problem, which is to say tracing out this stuff, you want to say, okay, I want to embed the distortions that we see in the rest of the world into the social planner problem. So the social planner is, in a sense, constrained, right? They can't get rid of all the taxes and other stuff that's hitting the rest of the world, but they can mitigate the market power on the part of OPEC. By contrast, when you do the inframarginal approach, what you're saying is OPEC does whatever it does, right? So it pulls back production to here, But what we compare an unconstrained social planner to is a social planner who takes OPEC's conduct as given, but then is able to treat the rest of the world as if it's lacking any other frictions, right? So we rotate the rest of the world's supply curve downwards, reflecting the fact that we're getting rid of all the other tax wedges and other distortions that might be affecting their behavior. Okay. So with that little bit of sort of going back to old school welfare economics, now let me talk about the oil industry. So as we've made clear, the applications are upstream oil. So that's basically everything that happens upstream of a refinery. I've talked about everything so far in static terms, but really because this is a finite extraction problem, what it means is that distortions when they arise are about when production happens, not if production happens, okay? So, if you adjust kind of your intuition with that in mind, you get everything right. So I'll give you a quick introduction to the cartel and the data we're using. So OPEC is a bunch of folk. Here's the list: Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Gabon, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi, UAE, and Venezuela. This is everyone who's been involved in OPEC since 1970. Some folks like Ecuador come in and out, but all of the Gulf states are always in there, and they're essentially the ones that matter. OPEC is a stunningly imperfect cartel, like every other cartel I've seen in the real world. It's rife with conflict, a lack of trust, and dysfunction. Let me say that I've been thinking about cartels for a long time now, and increasingly I think of them as dysfunctional families. So, in my family, we like each other and we still have trouble coordinating. In cartels, I've yet to see one where they didn't have significant arguments internally and a high level of distrust. And that's certainly the case here. It's useful to keep in mind that about 50% of the world's reserves are in OPEC, right? But the rate of extraction by OPEC members is about half as fast as the rest of the world. So what that should give you sort of some prima facie sense that OPEC is doing what you would expect a firm with market power to do, which is withholding production. It's also useful to note that the three biggest producers globally are Saudi, the US, and Russia, with about 10 to 15% of production each. To give you a sense of, a lot of this is going to be about kind of why, looking at the extent to which there are very different production cost differences in the world. And to give you a sense of this, this is what cheap oil extraction looks like. This is a conventional oil field in West Texas with these nodding donkey things, which are sucking oil out of the ground. So this is what oil production at about $8 a barrel in cost looks like. By contrast, this is the Asgard field off the coast of Norway in the North Sea. This is very expensive oil. This is about $50 a barrel. There's actually about 24 wells here. These two platforms here connect via a pipe to the bottom of the sea, which then fan out into about 12 wells each. This thing here is basically a hotel, and everything gets piped back to the shore. This is relatively recent technology. This stuff wasn't possible before about 1979. So this is actually probably the biggest technological advance in the oil industry since 1970, is working out how to get deep sea extraction going at economic cost. Okay. So, the data we're going to use, which lets a lot of this happen, is really...
Sorry, can I just quickly ask what?
Yes. Was there a question?
It's okay.
Okay.
It's not that important. It's just a small question. I just wondered what proportion by the cheaper means the donkeys.
Oh, what's this? This is actually quite a lot. So this is, I'd have to look at our numbers, but 50% of oil produced at least would be something that looks something like this. The basic supply curve for oil in any given year is a very hockey stick type thing. So there's a lot of oil that's produced for less than $15 a barrel. From my house in Los Angeles, I can see one of these things up on a ridge just behind LA, the LA airport. Yeah, they're pretty common.
Can I ask, just looking at that photograph, why is it so densely populated with these pumps? Presumably there's just one big reservoir underneath all this. Does that have to do with the issuing of property rights, rights to pump oil or something, and they're allocated on a very small area basis? Is that the reason why it looks like that?
No, so this will all be owned by one person. Any one of these things can't suck out that much oil relative to the size of the deposit.
Right.
And also, it's useful to think about it as basically a bucket that's underground, but this stuff doesn't flow particularly quickly.
Right.
So, my understanding of the petroleum engineering is that this isn't a crazy way to do it.
Right. Yeah. So it's necessary to do it in part because the reservoir under the ground is not pressured, right? So that you actually have to suck it out.
Yeah. So this is what's called secondary. Yeah. So there's a little pipe underneath this thing that when the donkey goes up, it creates a vacuum that sucks out a bit of the oil.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So the data we're going to use is from a Norwegian entity called Rystad, which sells their data product to everyone who's a banker or a producer or any kind of investment entity in this business. It's really quite interesting data. They cover roughly 90% of production in the world, and they have detailed cost data on every oil field that is essentially meaningful in the world. So, if it's an oil field that is more than a couple of those donkeys, it's in the data set. So we have 66,000 oil fields in the data, 19,000 of which produce crude oil before 2015. And it's very detailed data on production, line item of costs. So the level of cost detail is kind of extraction costs, SG&A, exploration cost, capital costs, which is building stuff, transportation costs, things like that. There's very detailed reserve data, technology, location, stuff like that. These data are magnificent for countries like the US and Norway, where there's a lot of public disclosure of this stuff. It's not bad for places like Saudi, which are well understood. They do the best they can, but that's probably all you can say for it. For places like Syria, where there's obvious issues with getting anything sensible out of such a dysfunctional place. So, let me show you what these data look like. And I'm going to step very slowly through these pictures. I'm actually going to spend some time on this just so it's bigger. This is Saudi Arabia. So let me unpack what this is. First, this black line here is just the oil price in 2014 US dollars per barrel. Okay. So here's the oil shocks in the late 70s, early 80s. This is the Asia crisis in the late 90s. Here's the global financial crisis in 2008. And, the run up that preceded it. Now, let me just, on the horizontal axis is time. Price is per barrel is on the vertical axis. You'll see that, say, for 1974, there's a black bar, and then there's some gray stuff. Let me focus specifically on the black bar. What that is doing is taking the 5th to 95th percentile of Saudi production per barrel by cost and showing you the cost range per barrel of that production. So basically 90% of Saudi production in 1974 in our data had a cost per barrel of between about $3 and $5 a barrel. The gray is exactly the same. It goes from 1% to 99%. And if you're curious about what the dots are, those are the maximums. Now, this is calculated very crudely, which is to say we just take, for each field in Saudi Arabia, we're going to work out how many barrels they produced, and we're going to take the total cost of production incurred by that field, divide it by their number of barrels, and that's the cost per barrel that we attach to each barrel that came out of that field. And it's for that reason, for instance, that you can see in 1970, this gray line goes super high. And what's happened there is that there's a field that gets built in 1970. It's a shallow offshore field, and it comes online in, I think, November. So there's a very small amount of production that year, and there's a heap of capital cost, right? So there's a big cost that's getting averaged over a small amount of barrels. You can see, though, that the black stuff, which is 90% of production, nothing much happens, right? It's very tight. And that pattern is consistent through the entire period. This bump here is tightness in the market for inputs that's related to the oil price up here. There's a limited number of people in the world that can do some of the specialized engineering. And when people are making a lot of money, they want a cut of the action. Now,
Sorry, can I interrupt just very briefly? How are you calculating costs here? I mean, you're actually including capital cost in your cost. I would have thought, those are sunk, right? So you just want to capture, but there may be fixed costs, which are things like maintenance of rigs and so forth.
Yeah.
And then you want your marginal costs.
Yep.
But I think you mentioned that you've incorporated capital cost in here. Is that correct?
Yeah, give me a production function and I'll tell you. Yeah,
I mean, for most of this, the capital cost is sunk. You really want to know what the current costs are, right?
Yeah. So, the reason why we did it this way for this initial data stuff is just to be totally transparent. Right. What we're going to do is we're going to assume a Leontief production function, which means that average cost and marginal cost are the same thing.
Right.
Right. And then, there's a little bit of an issue about how to deal with the sort of initial capital costs. For most of what we're doing, it turns out not to move the needle that much, although, we've obviously played with this. And fundamentally, the reason is about 70% of production assets are already producing by 1970. So that initial startup cost, the stuff that you would most naturally think of as sunk, is already done. Right? You can see that in Saudi, right? Because the black stuff is usually very tight.
Yeah. But if you had a picture of the US here, then you're going to have all the shale oil with very high costs. So you got it, okay. And so a lot of that is capital cost, isn't it? So.
Yeah, although shale's interesting. It's got a much shorter period of extraction, so it's got a lower capital cost. And a shale rig might run on a location for maybe 2 years. So it's difficult to know quite how to think about, that in the traditional sort of, marginal versus sunk dichotomy. As usual with doing that sort of economic cost accounting, you need to think about what the economic decision that you're really trying to get at is. And here,
well, the way you'd normally want to calculate capital cost is simply what the opportunity cost of the capital is, right? So in a sense, you want some rate of return that you would have then apply to the fixed to the actual capital investment, right?
Yeah, although
that would represent the capital cost.
If in the extreme you have to build the well, it extracts everything in 1 year and you're done. If your level of aggregation in the data is 1 year, which is what we've got, we don't need to confront that issue, right?
Okay.
And so the sort of the level of aggregation means that we're going to skid over a lot of that stuff. And where we can't, like for instance, the offshore stuff in Norway, basically what we're going to do is to construct things so that first year, we're either going to average it out, and to make sure that that's not screwing us up, we've also run everything such that we exclude the first year, and qualitatively there's not a lot of difference.
Okay, that's fine, thanks.
Yeah.
So John, following Rod's question, I'm just wondering whether you have the information about the capital utilization in your data that might help you to isolate these fixed cost and variable cost issues. And I think, so in your framework, the marginal cost, that is really matters.
Yeah, so we don't. And this is why we're going to write down a production function that tells us that average cost and marginal cost are the same thing for a field. There are reasons why that probably isn't strictly true, but when we're aggregating over typically around 13,000 fields are producing in any given year, and the cost differences across them are very big, from $3 to $4 a barrel to $80 a barrel. These kind of things, in terms of big numbers, in terms of the end numbers, are not going to be huge. It should be very clear that this is why the picture in front of you explains why Saudi princes drive around on gold and private jets, right? They have very low costs by any metric relative to the oil price. This is the US. This is all, the early part is all Texas. That's why Texas got rich. And all of this is shale, which is why recently a lot of people have lost a lot of money on shale bets because a bunch of those investments were higher cost than the oil price ever went. By the way, this is what Russia looks like, and gives you some sense of just how much money the Russian economy is deriving from oil. And as I said, a heap of it is going into the coffers of the government. This has sort of obvious implications for the unfortunate just humanitarian disaster happening in the Ukraine at the moment. Being mindful of the time, let me move a little faster. There are sort of a couple of modeling issues to operationalize here. The biggest one is that we need a production function that allows for the coherent interpretation of cost data, and we need to account for dynamics. Okay, so let me just show you quickly how those work. The first is, let me deal with the way we deal with production. So we're going to assume a homogeneous production market, a common discount factor, essentially for the social planner. We're going to assume that there's a Leontief production function, right? So, each element of production needs to happen in fixed proportion. And what that means is we have constant marginal costs such that marginal cost and average cost are the same thing. Now we're going to model that for a field F in year T. We're going to model marginal costs as having a field constant, and then there's going to be this mu ST shifter, right? S indexes technology like offshore and onshore, T is time. If you give me the assumption that beliefs in the industry are such that mu is a martingale, then these four assumptions are sufficient for the following, which is that for any production level or sequence of production levels, what the social planner will do is extract the cheap stuff first, right? So this is sufficient for saying that we can reduce a fairly complicated dynamic programming problem about the social planner's production decisions into a pretty simple cheap stuff goes first exercise. Now, the next thing we need to do is to define the welfare objects of interest in a fully dynamic setting, right, which I haven't done yet. So let me do that. The first thing I need to define is loss gains from trade. So this is going to be the net present value of the difference between the realized gains from trade, right, and the gains from trade had the production path been chosen by a social planner, right? It's sort of a natural, I hope, extension of static intuitions. Productive inefficiency is going to be very similar. It's the NPV of the difference between the realized cost of production and the cost of production had the actual production path been produced by the social planner, right? So if you produced 100 barrels in 1970 and 200 in 1971, the social planner has the freedom to move productive, choose who produces, but they can't move the fact that in aggregate, they've got to produce 100 barrels in 1970 and 200 in 1971. Deadweight loss is hard to define, so I cheat and just go, that part of the loss gains from trade, which can't be accounted for by productive inefficiency, is what I'm going to call deadweight loss. And that turns out to be the most elegant way to define that in a dynamic setup. So let me describe what the social planner is going to do. The social planner we model as maximizing the gains from trade in NPV terms from transactions, right? So there's an intertemporal trade-off which the social planner is engaging in between production and consumption today and production and consumption tomorrow. And clearly at the center of that is the extent to which the social planner is discounting the future relative to the present. Okay. But what you want to have in mind is the social planner wants to maximize the NPV of gains from trade. I apologize for not giving you this, in formal terms, but the notation is sort of heavy for little additional benefit. So when there's a paper, I can show it to you more properly. Now, to calibrate all of this stuff up and get quantification, I need a demand curve and I need some costs that come from data. Empirically, our marginal cost estimates are going to be very, very similar to the model framework I showed you. The difference is we're just going to hit it with some noise as well, which we're going to interpret as classical measurement error. So the way we estimate costs for a field is to take the field average across years. That gives us our field invariant factor, and then look at the across fields to work out what the shifter is from year to year. Okay, and this washes out a fair bit of the kind of initial capital cost issues that we were discussing earlier. That's not particularly econometrically interesting, but it works. It also follows the earlier AER paper that Simon referred to at the beginning of the talk. The demand curve is going to be a linear demand curve, estimated in a very classical way. Obviously, never in the history of the industry have we seen a cost per barrel that's in excess of $200. I venture to speculate that we may see that depending on what the EU does with Russian oil imports in the next 6 months. But at least in our data, we don't see that. We're going to sort of cap demand at 200 with the view that if oil went above that for an extended period, that would generate a bunch of changes to things that we just are not in a position to model. Nonetheless, with the data we have, we're going to use a linear demand curve with shifters being GDP and some time trends. Let me just sort of talk you through how we get an elasticity here.
A quick question on the demand curve.
Sorry?
Is this a global demand curve? Is that
yes,
GDP
it is.
for the world, or is that
is
that a demand curve facing each individual well or something?
No, it's global.
It's global.
So this is
Okay.
the
So
aggregate global.
We're looking at global GDP and not
Yep.
so much the distribution of that GDP. I would have thought
that's correct.
that might matter, right?
Yeah, we played around with OECD and stuff like that, and it didn't make a lot of difference.
Okay. Okay.
You can see why just here. Here's the annual, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, and the chief empirical problem is that you've got the classic demand issue where if you just do an OLS regression, you get an upward sloping demand curve, which doesn't make sense. And when you look at the data cloud, you can see why. So what we need to do is to work out when there's shifts in these data that reflect predominantly movements in the cost curve. So this is a classical estimation problem. What we want to do is to focus on estimation where we know that it's the cost curve moving and the demand curve is plausibly more or less constant. So we are comparing this dot to this dot rather than say this dot to this dot. So, that's what IV regression does. And so we need to construct an instrument. Now in our data, because we actually see costs for all the fields, we kind of synthetically construct almost the perfect instrument. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick an inframarginal barrel that's not too far away from where the data is, and look at how its cost shifts from one year to the next, right? So, this should be a C rather than a Q, but for each year we can track how the supply curve is moving up and down. So the only thing you have to give me is that somewhat inframarginal movements in the supply curve, the cost curve, indicative of what's happening in the area of equilibrium. Beyond that, it's just a very straightforward IV regression. And what spits out elasticities of demand, which are plotted here. Now, because it's a linear demand curve, elasticity changes when price changes. And unsurprisingly, it looks a little bit like the price movements. What's comforting is that the point estimate of elasticity, which is the dark line, the dashes are confidence intervals pointwise, is in the sort of -0.3 to -0.1 range, which aligns with the various literatures that try to do this in wildly different ways. So, for instance, there's a macro time series literature that tries to get aggregate oil elasticities using co-integration type methods, which gets very similar sort of numbers. So, we are happy that our approach gives us something that's in line with some very different approaches by other folks. We also had the weird experience of being contacted by Saudi Aramco about what we were doing. And we talked to those guys, and they were cagey, but the impression that they gave us was that they didn't think these were crazy estimates. So that was nice.
Compare these elasticities for oil to those that have been found for petrol. There's a very pretty extensive body of estimates around petrol demand elasticities, which are about -0.5. Now, if we think about oil being some sort of fraction of the cost of petrol, you could back out one from the other. I don't know what that fraction is, but I'm guessing you probably do.
Yeah, so these would be consistent with that. This is upstream oil, so this is before it hits the refinery, and refinery costs are significant, right? So I think this is in the order of 15 to 20% of cost at the Bowser. Typically what you have is you have refinery costs, and then there's an intermediate market which has a bunch of massive companies that are all privately held in there. You've got pipeline guys, and then you've got rack, and then you've got the retail. And there's often curiously large price dispersion at retail. But you'll notice even here, -0.5 is just beyond the confidence interval in the year with the most elasticity when price is high. So I'm pretty comfortable with if that literature says, say, -0.5, this seems about very consistent with that.
Yeah. So you say that oil is about let's say 20% of the price of petrol. 20% of -0.5 is -0.1. So you're right on the money.
Yeah. Yeah, you would hope so, because one's derived demand of the other. I think about 70% of crude is used to make gasoline, and the rest is for things like bitumen and avgas and other things. All right. So we've got to calibrate some more. So let me just tell you how we deal with some stuff. The discount rate we're going to use is 0.95. Let me be very clear that we have no reason for doing that other than, when in doubt, that's what the literature seems to use for everything from toothpaste to whatever. So if we can't be right, we can at least be transparent. One of the things that folks that spend a bunch of time thinking about oil extraction worry about is the fact that you can't suck all the oil out of a well in 1 year. Apparently there's geology issues with that. So we limit the amount you can get out of any one field to be either the maximum we observe in data for that field or 10% of reserves. Obviously, fields can only be extracted after their discovery date. This means that we're holding the exploration process as exogenous, which, I think one of you raised the issue that different counterfactuals may in fact change that process, but we're punting on it. The other difficulty is that our data goes from 1970 to 2014, and obviously oil didn't disappear in 2014. So we need to close out the model. We're going to need to think about what the world does past the end of our data. It's like essentially tacking a continuation value onto the model. We're going to just let demand grow at the historical geometric rate. The main thing we do is we assume that after the end of our data, the world in reality, in addition to any counterfactual we run, is governed by the social planner. That's clearly nuts. But if we're discounting things back to 1970, we have 45 years of observed data before we impose that. So that's not having a huge impact in discounted terms. I think the numbers are discounted well below 10% at that point. Okay, so that's kind of more horror that we're tacking onto this thing. The exercise here is to now essentially do the analog of exactly that static exercise that we showed you before, but do it, taking the extraction dynamics and finite resource problem stuff seriously, right? So this is really where the guts of this thing are. And let me just focus on this set of results here. So from 1970 to 2014, the loss gains from trade in total, right? If we just look at the difference between the world as we find it versus an unconstrained social planner, right? That difference amounts to $6.2 trillion in net present value terms, where those dollars are measured as 2014 US dollars. So 6.2 trillion seems like a reasonably large number. My recollection of macro is that that's at least close to the kind of cost of a business cycle that Tom Sargent and others have measured. So if we think about this as essentially the cost of one US business cycle, that might give you some kind of benchmarking. Now, the impact of market power, or the extent to which this can be attributed to market power, depends on how we do the measurement. So if you recall, there were two ways that I claimed you could do the measurement. The first is inframarginal, which is to say, strip out all of the distortions in the rest of the world and just work out how much cost market power would be imposing in that environment. And the answer is a mere 750 billion. On the other hand, if you do this factoring in all the wedges that can be inferred from in the rest of the world, so in other words, taking a marginal approach and then tack market power on top of that, you get 5.7 trillion. Now, the interesting thing here that gives us pause, and this is where we're sort of contemplating where we go next with this project, is what accounts for the difference between these two very different approaches. Essentially, the difference, let me see if I can give you, let's go back. it's useful to look at, this is again a picture of the inframarginal approach. And what we find is that relative to the size of the area F, B, C, E, the shaded area is actually quite small. And what that means is that the distortions in the rest of the world are really very big. So this curve here is actually getting rotated down a lot. So it starts to look very, very similar to the unconstrained social planner stuff. I mean, it's still $750 billion worth of difference, but that's a mere 12% of the whole enchilada. So, you know, what that indicates, at least to us, is a bunch of, at least I think, quite interesting economic conclusions. And it's on these that I'll rest for the final 5 minutes of the talk. Sorry for skipping around so much. You know, as we've noted, the fact that the inframarginal measure is relatively small relative to the aggregate distortion means that it's the frictions in the rest of the world that are allowing OPEC's actions to have such a profound impact on activity. And I'm being a little loose when I say that. What I'm meaning is that the reason why we care about OPEC and why when OPEC changes its production or something, it is newsworthy, is because it's understood that the rest of the world, which forms the fringe, is not going to be able to take up the slack as aggressively as a unconstrained social planner might be able to. Another way of saying that is, it's the distortions in the rest of the world that allow OPEC to enjoy such outsized returns on their production plans. You know, to my mind, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about, you know, cartels and monopolies and where they come from and their social impact, and in particular how policy can mitigate any of the adverse impact that they have, you know, this is a sort of interesting observation, right? In particular, you know, it's reminiscent of a much older literature, you know, from the 70s and early 80s, that, you know, argued that the sources of monopoly power, whether for, you know, embodied in a cartel or anything else, you know, unsurprisingly, are barriers to entry. The interest was in where those barriers to entry might be, and, you know, what perpetuates them. So here we have a cartel that's had a significant impact on a globally important market for getting on 50 years. In an environment where if the fringe were actually able to respond quickly, this cartel would be functionally irrelevant. You know, stepping back from OPEC for a second and thinking more broadly, you know, it's a helpful reminder that the ability of the fringe to mitigate a monopoly or a cartel, you know, can be incredibly important. You know, in many instances that I've seen, you know, you look at a monopolized industry and wonder why entry hasn't wiped this out. And in the long run, you know, we know eventually that should happen. That's what we teach our undergraduates. And, you know, economic history is replete with examples where, at least in the particularly long run, that's happened. The reason, in some sense, why we have competition policy is because we don't want to wait for the long run to actually unwind, and we want to get things moving a little faster. This suggests that there may be a significant dividend for competition agencies like the ACCC, or in the US, the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission, to engage in advocacy that make sure that governments aren't adding to frictions that might limit the ability of competitors to mitigate market power, and also shift attention to mitigating barriers to entry that might be created by industry activity of various sorts. One of the things I find interesting about the numbers that I've shown you is that it suggests that if in fact in the OPEC example you're able to get the fringe to act in a relatively frictionless way, you would be able to mitigate a hell of a lot of OPEC's marginal impact on the world oil market. Let me also note that the numbers I showed you were in significant numbers of trillions. So regardless of what you think of exactly where they're coming from, they're big enough to at least push back on the old Harberger presumption that when thinking about the economy in the aggregate, you're fairly safe to just use the perfectly competitive model. This at least is a small sort of push back on that presumption, and it mirrors recent macro work by Simon Monge and others that have tried to embed oligopolistic structures into more traditional macro frameworks. So I think I'm out of time, but that's sort of where this project is at. Let me just end that what we're trying to work out now is how much light we can actually shed on the actual frictions in the fringe of that are affecting the behavior of non-OPEC countries, and that's why I don't have a fully fledged draft to show you quite yet. So thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, John. And then Rod, question?
Yeah, can I ask one? First of all, on your 7 trillion, I mean, that's 7 trillion over, I think, 45 or so years, right? So
yeah.
And the US economy alone would have generated over 400 trillion in that period, right? So the proportions are not all that large, really. I mean, it looks big, but as a percentage of total income generated in the global economy, it's probably not that big. But I'm confused about the effects of non-OPEC distortions, which your results seem to make very large here. What it's suggesting is that non-OPEC distortions exacerbate the departure from where the social planner would want the equilibrium to be, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the theory of the second best point. What's startling is quite how large that is. Yeah, but then does it make sense? I mean, my sense is that if you look at distortions, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe that the additional distortions, for example, like gasoline taxes and so on in many countries, like in Europe, of course, gasoline tax is very high. In Japan, gasoline tax is very high. So, and so they may be larger than the OPEC rents. And so maybe in that sense, perhaps it makes sense. I would have thought in many countries, especially the developing world, there is a tendency for governments to distort in the opposite direction, right? To subsidize fuel. Take Indonesia, for example, I mean, because it's a politically sensitive item. Yeah, I mean,
and if it were that, then what you would have is distortions outside OPEC offsetting the effects of OPEC on the price, rather than exacerbating it. But what you're suggesting is you've got these very big, in essence, there are taxes on petroleum use that are being added in countries that are facing a price that's already distorted upwards. Which
I bear in mind that I'm going to pick an OPEC country, but in Nigeria, which is an oil producer, 75% or thereabouts of government revenue comes from oil royalties. right? I mean, that's a massive amount of tax.
Yeah.
Outside OPEC, you have nationalized industries in Mexico, in Brazil, Indonesia. Well, I mean, Indonesia is an OPEC member, but
it's a member, but it doesn't export oil.
yeah, I mean, it's a puzzle to me why they're there, but whatever. Russia clearly gets a lot of revenue from oil. Norway has been a strategic player in this market. So, the Asia crisis back in the late 90s is an interesting example. So what happens there is that OPEC decides to pull back on production at exactly the same time as all the mess happened in Asia. World demand pulls back at exactly the same time. Sorry, OPEC decides to expand production at the same time as world demand contracts, right? So the price just tanks. And coming out of the Asia crisis, what OPEC did was it reached out to Norway and to Russia and said, look, can we cooperate for a year or two so to get everything back into kind of a $30 a barrel type range? And that was the beginning of what you might see in the press as referred to as OPEC plus. But that in itself points to the potential for certain actors outside OPEC to be operating in somewhat strategic ways. And, if indeed Norway and Russia and maybe a few other countries do have some, residual market power that out beyond that, which we're looking at for OPEC, that's like a tax wedge. It just operates in a slightly different way, right?
Yeah. Well, but the big question though is when you look at your graphs that compare costs with price, there's a very large rent in there, as you pointed out. But many of these government deals, such as in Nigeria or in Norway, there are agreements between the producers and the government to share that rent rather than add to it. Right? So, because what your results seem to be saying is that the actual price to consumers is higher even than that price on that graph. Right? And it's being distorted further upwards. Right? But my sense is that if you'd look at, I mean, I don't know, but for certain, but in Norway and places like that, what it is a government deal with the producers. You can produce in our country, but we're going to share the rents. You're going to get some, but we're going to get some too, right? And so they're sitting underneath that price line you've got there, I think. And so your outside OPEC story is really about distortions above that price line, I think.
Yeah. So first, Norway might well be efficient, but I dare say that Russia is not sharing those rents in an efficient way. Right? The mechanism they're using is, I think, a revenue share, which is distortionary. If they're not using direct taxation. The other thing is that even if the point about focusing on productive inefficiency in addition to deadweight loss is that you can have inefficiency on inframarginal units of production, right?
Yeah.
So, that means that it's not only places close to sort of the margin in terms of price that we're concerned about here in terms of welfare impact.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot for all that. I enjoyed the seminar, John. Very good.
Cool. Very nice to see you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So John, actually, so I have one question about the slide. So can you just move back to the figure you show, the big difference between the two, the marginal approach and the inframarginal approach? I think I'm quite interested in the big difference between the two numbers, and I'm wondering what is the sources of this, this big difference. So here, so I'm just wondering, do you think this distribution of the cost of different fields across countries or even within countries matters here? The thing is, here you also consider the welfare loss was include this production efficiency. And if my understanding is correct, this also includes some misallocation across the different oil fields. And in that sense, the distribution or the variance of this marginal cost of different fields matters here. When the OPEC decide to cut the output, for example, then that would change the production plan across all the available fields. And then that would change the distribution of the marginal cost across fields. And then that would affect this production efficiency consequently. Do you think it is possible?
Yeah, your intuition's pretty good. The if you look on this, something I didn't talk about is that we, across down here, we compare inframarginal to marginal in terms of the share of the total loss gains from trade that are attributable to deadweight loss. And you'll notice that in the inframarginal case, most of it is productive inefficiency, right?
Yeah. In that sense, then, yeah.
A third, basically, whereas it's about 85% with marginal. So, what that means is that you're in thinking about what's in this 750 billion, it's mostly productive inefficiency, which isn't surprising because you're rotating the fringes supply curve enough that you're not really changing total production relative to the social planner that much. And so the main source that you can get a welfare effect from is, the incorrect allocation of production to units that are somewhat less efficient than would be optimal.
Yes, if that is correct. Maybe you can just, for example, just show the two numbers. One is just for example, the distribution, or you just calculate the variance or the mean of the marginal cost of the oil fields in the two scenarios, and make a comparison to say that is one possible explanation.
Yeah,
of course, I think there are many possible channels that could lead to this difference. In addition to these production efficiency issues, I think another thing is just, as Rod mentioned, the taxation issues also matters here. Here, what I'm thinking in mind is just here, because there are many taxes in different countries and in this oil industry. In addition to the normal taxation for all industries, I think there's some resource taxes on these oil industries as well. So in the framework of this production efficiency, I think here, if the tax is on profit or rent, that could lead to the dispersion in the effective tax rate across the oil fields. Because here you are thinking about output. Okay, think about the profit tax. If the tax rate is just proportional, like a flat tax, then this tax is just proportional to the profit. But if the profit is not proportional to the output, that means when the output change, then actually the effective tax rate change.
Yeah, the thing that I pause on is that typically, if you're doing a profit tax, it's non-distortionary. Now, I'd have to think about whether a social planner would think about things that way. But in thinking about the the firm as a unitary actor, a profit tax is non-distortionary. To the extent that these are actually revenue shares or production shares, that would clearly be distortionary taxation.
Yeah, so John, here I think
the thing you worry about is the extensive margin, which is to say, if you extract all of the profits, then you're not going to be able to cover any fixed costs. So you're not going to get production in the first place, but that would be a distortion at the extensive margin rather than the intensive margin.
Yes, in my mind, it's not just the tax itself. It is about the dispersion in the effective tax rate across the oil fields. Dispersion matters. So even all oil fields have the same flat profit tax rate, but if the profit out of the value added or out of the output, they have different ratio. Then different oil fields still have different effective tax rate, okay, in the theoretical framework. Because here, when you calculate the the production efficiency, what really matters here is just the dispersion in this tax rate, rather than just the tax rate itself. So that's what I'm trying to understand, what are the sources of this big difference. There's another possibility I think you may consider.
I mean, there's that. There's also there's various literatures that have floated around for 30 years on how relatively small adjustment costs can be magnified under various conditions, whether that's uncertainty or market structures. Like Emmanuel Fari and David Backey's work can feel like this a little. There's also just really boring stuff. Like it takes a while to expand port capacity. So there are these sort of lumpy investments that matter. Even if Texas wanted to double its production, it wouldn't be able to get it to refineries because there's only a certain amount of pipeline capacity that you have and port capacity. So these kind of supporting infrastructure issues seem important. And, I've wondered whether the sort of, there are incentives to not overinvest in capacity when all it would do would allow you to respond more competitively than you might otherwise like and diminish total industry profits.
Okay, thank you, John. So very interesting results and thought-provoking, I think, some results, especially this production efficiency issues. So Emiliano, so any questions?
Hi, yes, just thinking about the model. So when you compute these two paths, the real path and the counterfactual path, using a fixed discount rate, what is the role there for the hoteling rule on the price of the oil?
Sorry, the what rule?
The hoteling rule.
Let me show you. So here's the oil price in reality, right?
Yeah.
And this is the price path of the unconstrained social planner at a discount rate of 0.95. This is 0.9, this is 0.8, and this is myopic.
Right, I see. So the one on the left.
So it
doesn't increase that much. Well, it goes from 20, 60.
Yeah, it doesn't get kind of, I think in about 2030 is when you start to see it bang up to 200.
This is 2000. Okay, that's the real path, right?
Yeah.
But then if you follow it to 2100, so what is the price that you get at the end of the path?
So remember, we capped the demand curve at
right.
I think in this one actually we capped it at 350.
I see.
And it hits that sometime in the 2030s.
All right, I see. Thanks.
Sorry, can I ask another quick one?
Of course.
Yeah, Rod, yeah, please.
But normally with a hoteling diagram like that, you'd expect it to end at the price of the nearest, most elastically supplied alternative product, right? And so that exponential rise of the interest rate stops at some point, which I would think is going to be substantially less than $200 a barrel. And then you've got continuous substitution that's going on toward alternative products in the course of the rise of the price. So that's just a point of detail on that diagram. And you were talking about a story earlier on at the time of the Asian financial crisis. I mean, I have a different story about the pre-GFC period, right? So, and that goes pretty quickly. It just goes that the yield on treasury bonds is declining very substantially throughout the 2000s. The Saudis see this decline. The Saudis decide that their portfolio is best managed if they keep some of their oil in the ground. They then refuse after 2005 and 6. They then refuse to accommodate this continually rising demand, in part due to China's extremely large growth rate at the time. And so the oil price shoots through the roof to 140 something dollars a barrel. So that's just one story, and I've written about that. Although we didn't quite make it into the AER with that paper. But the other interesting story is that you can make a claim that this is one of the major drivers of the GFC, because you have this real increase in the oil price, very, very large increase in the oil price, which then causes cost push inflation in the US, which then causes the Greenspan Fed to jam on the brakes. And people don't remember just how large. They had a rise within 6 months, a rise in the short-term yield in the US of 4 percentage points, right? I mean, just imagine now we're so upset if we get a rise of 0.25, right? 25 basis points.
I'm totally with you. I don't understand why US people are focusing on this, on the interest rate stuff. I mean, freaking out about the quantitative tightening, I can see, but the 50 basis points is, I don't get it.
Yeah, it's pretty trivial, isn't it? Well, the quantitative, I mean, the stock of central bank assets is really the biggest determinant in the US of monetary tightening. I mean, what they decide to do. And it becomes quite important in Australia too, because we've been doing unconventional monetary policy now for 2 years. And one could argue that that's very poorly motivated, but that's irrelevant to this issue. It just struck me that you can make a strong case that the behavior of OPEC and the Saudis in particular would have been a major determinant of the shock that caused the GFC. I mean, that 4 percentage point rise prior to the GFC must have been the thing that tipped all the mortgages over in the US and then caused the cascade that followed. Just a comment.
What you say is completely consistent with my sort of IO understanding here, which is that, interestingly, in the early 2000s, OPEC probably entered its most effective period in terms of coordination and organization. They had a reasonably functional quota system going until about 2008. And, that may be that they actually had an incentive to do it, given the yield on treasuries, which is to say they did want to pull back, and they were highly motivated to make sure that pulling back actually worked. I should say in passing that I was living in New York as an assistant professor when, Lehman went under. And that was an education in why it's nice to be in an industry that doesn't have a lot of cyclical exposure. I was teaching at NYU at the time, and we actually lost $10 million in revenue from Lehman going under in executive programs that we didn't get paid for.
Wow.
Yeah.
But your particular job was not Lehman sensitive by the sound of it.
No, I had a co-author who was teaching in that exact program literally the day before Lehman went under. And he was left with a dubious or difficult thing where we literally had a discussion over lunch about, how does he grade these people on this course, which doesn't exist and they can't do an exam, right?
Sure.
So what we ended up doing was just saying you should just give them all A's in the sense they probably had a more practical education in economics than we'll ever be able to give them.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, thanks a lot for that, John.
Yeah. So John, can I ask one more questions here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think finding is interesting. I'm just thinking whether the result can also shed light on to people who is interested in misallocation and even public finance. Because in public finance literature, this revenue mobilization from natural resources is always a big topic. And there's a theory in public finance arguing that some countries which has lower tax capacity than the government would like to encourage this monopoly power in market. The reason is only with monopoly power, and then the firm can create the rents, and then government can tax the rents. Otherwise, it's hard for government to tax the companies. Okay, so this is one theory. So here you can see the interaction between these the rents created by the oil fields, and also although you do not state it explicitly, but I think some distortions include this tax and also include some other distortions. And then here you can see the interaction between this monopoly power and the taxation issues. There's some factors that might be included in as an interaction term that just a part, I think, could be the part of the difference between the marginal and inframarginal analysis. That's one thing I think I would like to take away as a public finance person.
Yeah, I'm entirely sympathetic to that. I mean, I may even go further, which is to say, if you think about the nationalization of the industry in Mexico and other places.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there are some papers talking about the timing of the nationalization of this oil industry. So there's one paper published in Journal of Law, Economics and Organization. They found when the oil price is hiking, then okay, the oil companies are more likely to be more nationalized. Okay, that's another issue. Okay, the nationalization and this oil industry. So, but anyway, so just about the revenue mobilization issues. The rents, taxation, nationalization are actually interplay with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm. That sounds entirely sensible to me. I'm going to leave it to the public finance guys, though. It's if they want to run with it, that'll be awesome. And it strikes me as entirely sensible. Another fun wrinkle might be to think about the political economy side of it as well, right? Once you get these massive nationalized industries, they have an influence on government as well as government having an influence on them.
Yeah, that's about, I think, when you talk about the monopoly power, I think a more fundamental issue is why, okay, under some conditions, why, okay, this OPEC country decide to cut. Of course, there are some economic reasons, but there are also some other reasons, political reasons or revenue mobilization reasons, for them to do that. And that would affect the magnitude of the output cut, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, can we be conscious that probably it's very late for John in LA now? We probably need to let him to go to bed.
Yeah.
You guys are, I mean, it's, I am grateful for that and appreciate it. But at least you're not in Europe. I gave a talk in Europe a little while ago where I had to get out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Right. Yeah.
That was quite unpleasant.
Mm.
It's been a pleasure to give this talk, and I'm sorry I can't do it in person, but hopefully sometime.
Yeah. Hopefully in the future you have a chance to visit us in person.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we wrap it up? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah. Thank you,
Have a good
John.
night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye bye.